Hi, Valentina.
All right, I think we have people here. Welcome, everyone. It's really great to see your smiling and lovely faces. Some of you are up really early at 7:30. Some of us, our day has already started, and some of you, your day is probably going towards the end, but we really are excited to have all of you here today for the side events, and really thankful to our panelists who are really great and distinguished and who agreed to be part of the side events. We know every women's major group side event is always fun, lit, and lots of information are shared. So we're really glad to have everyone here. So before we get started, I'm going to hand over to the interpreters to just welcome and share information that's going to be needed so that we all can participate fully. So handing over to the Spanish interpreter.
Thank you. Buenos días. Good morning. Mi nombre es María Angélica. Mis pronombres son ella y ellex, y hoy mi colega Flavia y yo estamos proveyendo interpretación en español con Marv Language Services para asegurarnos de que hoy tengamos acceso a este espacio y también que nos podamos expresar en el idioma que nos sintamos cómodos entre el español y el inglés. También nuestras colegas estarán proveyendo interpretación en francés. Para activar la interpretación en Sumoy, si están en su computador, van a ver un globo abajo a mano derecha que dice interpretación. Cuando le hacen clic al globo, pueden elegir español si quieren escuchar y participar en español, inglés si quieren participar y escuchar en inglés, francés si quieren participar y escuchar en inglés, en francés, o si tal vez hablan los tres idiomas y quieren escuchar el audio original, pueden mantener su interpretación apagada. Si están en su teléfono, va a lucir un poco diferente. En su teléfono, en la pantalla de Zoom, cuando la tocan, hay 3 puntos que dicen más. Cuando tocan los puntos, eligen interpretación de idiomas. Ahí pueden elegir su idioma de preferencia y después presionan hecho. Las instrucciones van a estar en los 3 idiomas a lo largo de la reunión en el chat de Zoom. Muchas gracias, y ahora I will pass the mic on to our French colleagues. Thank you.
Bonjour, ici Camille et Clara pour l'interprétation vers le français. Comme nos collègues espagnols viennent de l'écouter, vous avez une option d'interprétation dans 3 langues, anglais, espagnol ou français. Vous pouvez bien sûr écouter l'interprétation vers le français en cliquant en bas de l'image sur le globe et sélectionner la langue française. Si vous écoutez depuis un smartphone, vous pouvez également le faire en cliquant sur les 3 points. Validez la langue française et tapez OK et vous pourrez écouter directement l'interprétation. Merci et bonne séance.
All right. Thank you so much to our Spanish and our French interpreters. And again, just want to say a warm welcome to everyone. Thank you for being here. I do want to note that before we start, that this is a safe space for all people in all of their diversities. And so if there are any anti-rights language or narrative being spouted or used in this space, we will remove you because we want this to be a respectful, productive, safe conversation. And we're also recording this meeting. So in any ways, we do not want anyone to leave feeling shaken or unhappy or sad. So please, if you are planning to do any of that, I would respectfully ask you to leave in that sense. All right, so today we are here to basically have a conversation about why a holistic approach to SDGs, from theory to reality. And you know that's something we're passionate about as Women's Major Group. For those of you who don't know what the Women's Major Group is about or who we are, it was created in 1992 at the Earth Summit in Rio, in Brazil, where governments recognized women as one of the 9 important groups in society for achieving sustainable development. And so we are an official participant in the UN processes on sustainable development. So that's who we are, and we're really excited for all of you for joining us. So if you are here and you haven't introduced yourself in the chat, please go ahead And do that, we would love to know where you're coming from and your interests. And also if you have questions and also comments, please definitely put it in there because we'll try and find ways to incorporate it into the event as well. I also want to now take the time to introduce our speakers so that once I do that, we can get right to the conversation. We have some really great speakers with us today. We have, first, I'm going to introduce the Deputy Permanent Representative of Mexico to the United Nations, Ambassador Juan Sandoval-Mendiolea. He's the His Excellency, the Ambassador, is the Vice President of the ECOSOC, as well as the President of the Working Group on Amendments of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. He also chairs the Group of Friends on Voluntary National Reports and on the follow-up of the Agenda 2030. And he has been decorated by Spain with the Order of Isabella the Catholic. So we're really grateful to have you here. Thank you for joining us today. We also have Ambassador Charlotta Schlyter. She's the head of section for sustainable development at the Permanent Mission of Sweden to the United Nations. She is a Swedish diplomat and a Swedish ambassador and the head of section, like I mentioned. Prior to this post, she served as the Swedish ambassador to Bangladesh and was the deputy head of mission at the embassy located in Bangkok in Thailand. So really glad to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us. We also have one of our members, Racherla. She is from ARROW, the Asian Pacific Resource and Research Center for Women. She is the deputy director at ARROW. She has been working in the area of women, health and rights, in particularly sexual and reproductive health and rights, research, monitoring, and advocacy for the past 20 years. She co-wrote the ARROW ICPD regional monitoring reports. She's been actively engaged in the youth movement building around the SDGs in the region. And she has also been active as the ARROW representative, along with co-conveners in developing a space for young people to discuss through the regional youth forums, which are held every year ahead of the Intergovernmental Forum. We also have a dear friend of the Women's Major Group, Eleanor, who's an independent consultant, and I know she's known to most of you. She specializes in sustainable development and women's rights with an expertise in international policy and advocacy, including UN processes on climate change, sexual and reproductive health and rights, cities, disaster risk reduction, migration, and gender equality. Her work has incorporated research, capacity building, and movement building. And she has also served as, an organizing partner for the Women's Major Group. So really excited to have these really great panelists who are with us today. So I am going to ask a couple of questions to our panelists, 2 rounds of questions really, and I'm trying to move fast so we can get started. And then from then on, we hope if you have questions, we're able to post them. And if you have comments, we're able to share them as well, because we want this to be as engaging as possible. So really excited about that. So my first question is going to be to Ambassador Sandoval. So our question to you is that Mexico was one of the first member states proposing to review all 17 SDGs each year during HLPF. In reference to the holistic nature of Agenda 2030. Would you mind just telling us a little bit about why Mexico decided that this was the route to go and why they developed this proposal?
Thank you very much. Very good morning to all. It's a real pleasure having this conversation, especially in this topic where Mexico has always been an advocate of the interlinkage nature of the SDGs. From the beginning of the process, I would like to point out that Mexico rejected any attempt to fragment the 2030 agenda or to hierarchize any of its objectives and goals. If we have learned anything in 6 years of the implementation of Agenda 2030, is the interdependence of the SDG and their integral nature for the well-being of people. It will be responsible to propagate artificial divisions in the face of every real challenges as the COVID-19 pandemic impacts. And you will see there is a huge contradiction in the resolution where we approve all the methodologies for the HLPF, because in one paragraph, you say that everything and all the SDGs are interdependent. In the next paragraph, you divide them into clusters, which is absolutely a big mistake that Mexico noted from the beginning. And we really broke the silence in 2015, and we spent like 2 months without approving the resolution, but there was no consensus around it. And even if we try very hard, now the time has given us the reason that it was a real mistake of creating this clustering. Regarding the thematic reviews, we suggest that the conclusions of the Global Sustainable Development Report be used to review the Sustainable Development Goals, trying to find options and a solution for the clustering. We should respect their comprehensiveness and avoiding this artificial segmentation. Each year, 1 of 2 entry points that will be like themes, thematic issues could be evaluated, and each day for 5 days, 1 of the 4 levels, with the last day evaluating countries in special situations. We have also been trying to do this, and again, there is big resistances for changing. The lack of integration demonstrates the fruitless impact of some of our policies. So there we are, we're in a permanent fight. The most evident proof that to cluster the SDGs is a huge mistake is SDG 5, because it is not possible not seeing SDG 5 every single year, and it must be seen every single year. And it's something that Mexico has very strongly advocated for, and nobody wants to oppose there. But finally, when the time for taking the decisions arrive, there is not much support for having this different approach, because it would make all the logic of having gender assessment of the SDGs as a main cross-cutting element to all 2030 agenda. And it has been our cause. It's what we have been fighting for, but we really need your help with countries and even with the Secretariat, trying to convince them. We haven't succeeded in doing so, but well, we will try our best. Thank you.
Thank you so much for answering that question so succinctly, and to really see your commitment to really ensuring the interlinkages and the interconnectedness of the SDGs. And I really did take some of the key things that you said around that clustering. It was, a mistake, and the fact that we're not reviewing SDG 5 every year. But like you said, it's a permanent fight, and we're going to keep fighting, and it's great to have Mexico as an ally in being able to do this. So thank you so much for that really strong answer. And I'm going to come back to you with one more question, but let me go back to our other panelists first, and we'll come back to you. So if you have any questions, please make sure you're putting it in the chat so that I can capture it as well. So now I'm going to move to Ambassador Schlyter. And my question to you is, how does Sweden see and apply the interconnection between gender equality and sustainable development? I know you're one of the first countries to really talk about a strong feminist foreign policy. So I'm really curious about how you have been able to apply the interconnection between gender equality and sustainable development, specifically in SDG implementation at the national and the local levels within the country.
Well, thank you, Chair, and hello, everyone. Good morning. It's great to be with you today, and thank you for the question. We believe that gender equality really, of course, stands as in its own right as a goal, but it's also essential as a cross-cutting driver to achieve sustainable development, and these two really cannot be separated. And indeed, and as you mentioned, the feminist foreign policy has been a great way to work with this. It's allowed us to work holistically, putting gender up front so that we can use coordinated foreign policy instruments and also the whole 2030 agenda in our national and international commitments. So our focus in 2021 will be on continuing to pursue gender and rights perspective in the pandemic response and recovery, and then also to ensure that our commitments and initiatives actually contribute to building back better, as well as immediate help. And increased resilience for groups that are discriminated against, and predominantly women and girls who've been the most affected by this pandemic. So I'll take a few examples of how we've been working nationally, and going back a few years. Since 94, we've been working with integrating gender equality across all activities, and I'd like to mention 4 areas that have been identified where it's particularly important to have the perspective with you at every turn. One is the national budget. Another one is legislation. Third one is guidance to Sweden's over 500 authorities. And then 4 in the Swedish engagement with the EU. So these are really all the fundamental things that shape policy and decisions. So at the local level, we see engagement all over to expand the scope of who is affected by the lack of gender equality and other forms of discrimination. I'm going to mention Malmö, which is Sweden's 3rd largest city, which uses an intersectional perspective in conducting gender analysis, and so that can shed light on how different power structures interact, recognizing that people are carriers of several identities. So last year, the government instituted a commission to investigate what measures need to be taken to ensure equal income between men and women over a lifespan. And this includes the distribution of public resources, as well as salaries and gender equal work spaces. So that was my 3rd example. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a great example, and it's great to see Sweden leading in that area, quite important, especially around the issues of equal pay and distribution of public resources, so not just in salaries alone. So it's really great to see that, and we hope to see more countries doing that as well. So thank you so much for sharing that. Now I'm going to go to Sai. My question to you is, Sai, how do you see the integration of young persons' human rights and their engagements within the Agenda 2030 space?
Thank you, Buky. And I would have a PowerPoint presentation if that can be shared. Good day to everyone. So in response to the question, firstly, I would like to say that I represent the Asian Pacific Resource and Research Center for Women. And ARROW has been working with young people in all their diversity. And we had key initiatives like the Right Here, Right Now partnership and building next generation movement leaders. And along with youth-led, youth-serving women and feminist partners, we have been working to advance gender equality and sexual and reproductive health and rights of young people in all their diversity, and ensuring that there is no stigma, there's no discrimination, and there is meaningful participation. So this is the work of the organization. And in response to the question, can I go to the next slide? So why are we even talking about young people? Because young people are a significant demographic. In 2019, 1.2 billion young people in the age group of 15 to 24 years have existed in this world, and which is about 16% of the global population. And from the region where I come from, which is the Asia and the Pacific region, 60% of world's young people actually stay in this region, which is about 750 million young persons. Despite all this demographic, young people are not able to access their full sustainable development agenda. The region is far behind in achieving the SDG goals. Especially in the COVID context, this has become even more exacerbated in terms of pushback. Gender equality, sexual and reproductive health and rights, they remain unfulfilled, and especially women and young people are facing the brunt of this situation. Young people are continuing to be neglected, they are tokenized, they are marginalized in policies, programs, and budget allocations. We wanted one of our youth forum representative to make this presentation, and she comes from Afghanistan. And unfortunately, today she had problems accessing the internet, and as a result of which we are representing her here. But this also speaks about a lack of access and lack of opportunities for young people in different contexts. We can go to the next slide. So we can go to the next slide. So from the different engagements we have been having with young people as part of the SDG follow-up and review in the Asia and the Pacific region, young people themselves came up with different call to actions. And this is how they see the integration of young people's human rights and their engagements needs to happen within the 2030 agenda. And they want to be seen in the center of sustainable development and as equal partners in turning the 2030 agenda into reality. Young people have reiterated through their many engagements that this ambitious SDG agenda can only be achieved with young people's leadership, with their meaningful participation and support, and empowering youth-adult partnerships, youth and youth responsive policies, and respect for young people's human rights, and also addressing issues of shrinking civic space for young people. They are asking for spaces to be created to meaningfully engage in the SDG implementation, but also in the follow-up, in the review and the monitoring and evaluation at all levels, from the local, national, to the regional, and to the global levels. Shrinking spaces for civic society, and this needs to be addressed, and institutional spaces and funding for young people and women's organizations and marginalized voices, they need to be ensured by the UN and by the governments. We go to the next slide. And youth-centric indicators is something that has been in the discussion across all SDG goals, and also at the national level when the SDG roadmaps at the national level are being implemented. The monitoring systems, young people are calling for disaggregated data across age, but also within age, we all recognize that young people are not a homogeneous group, they are a heterogeneous group. So then the data needs to be collected across gender, disability status, migration, citizenship status, income groups, education, ethnicity, indigenous status, and many other variables, because that will basically inform how we will not leave anybody behind. Also, alternative reporting. We are talking about VNR processes and how young people can have their own alternative reporting processes, and that needs to be recognized as part of monitoring and review process. We can go to the next slide. So a provision of finances for youth issues and youth-led organizations and movements, and conditionalities and bureaucratic processes that hinder access to funding, they need to be removed, especially because most of the youth-led organizations are not in a very structured or a registered format. Access to accurate evidence-based comprehensive sexuality education in all settings, whether formal, non-formal, and out-of-school workplace settings, is something that young people have been asking for. And digital literacy for all young people, especially in the context of COVID-19, and enabling access to ICT technology, especially is something that needs to be in the radar in order to integrate young persons' human rights and their engagement within the SDG agenda space. I will stop here.
Thank you so much. Okay. Thanks. Maybe you have a chance to continue with some of it in the next question, but really appreciate you amplifying the voices of young people, especially because I work with young people as well. And all of the things you said are really accurate in terms of even within the African region, they are asking for exactly the same thing, you know, being included in these processes and them being at the center of the SDGs in particular, the need for comprehensive sexuality education, the need for digital literacy. So we can see that these are all across the various continents, these are all what young people are asking for. And I'm hoping that those who are here are paying attention and that not only are we doing it in our organizations, but that governments are also seeing this as important and quite necessary. So thank you so much for those important interventions in that way. Right now, I'm going to move to Eleanor. Eleanor, you were one of the women's major groups that was members that has been there from the beginning of this post-2015 conversation. You were there. So would you mind sharing with us on how and why the SDGs were developed to be holistic, which I think the ambassador from Mexico talked a little bit about, for it to be a holistic and comprehensive agenda. And then more importantly, why this silo cluster approach that we're seeing, why is it not working?
Thank you, Buky, and thank you for inviting me to this. I had some fun thinking about these questions beforehand, taking a little bit of a walk down memory lane. So I'm going to take the opportunity to go back in time to 2012 to 2014 to a few moments that I think can illustrate where we were then and will help us see have we made much progress until now. So thinking back to 2012 and Rio Plus 20, we were really focusing on what is sustainable development and making clear to the world that that had the three dimensions of economic, social, and environmental. And that wasn't really clear at that time. It feels like second nature to us now, but there was really a genuine divide between the development worlds and the environmental worlds, and where they were looking at processes and goals and how to make change. And they weren't really speaking across those divides. One of the other issues before the 2030 agenda was also the donor-driven aspect of the MDGs and its focus really on action in the global South as opposed to action in and from the global North. So the idea of the holistic agenda that we're at now really came from that, overcoming that. But also, it was recognizing the silos even then, the more discrete silos between not just development and environment, but specific areas of gender equality or trade or migration. And through the process, the Women's Major Group had a really strong role to help illustrate what it means to be holistic and inclusive, and really talk about how all issues are women's issues. And the Women's Major Group is certainly not the first. There are many amazing women from across the world who've made these points, and we were able to build upon that and sort of stand on their shoulders in this space. And we wanted to showcase that a holistic agenda has to see that trade inequities impact women, trade inequities especially impact Black and Latino women in the global North, but also other marginalized groups around the world in the global South, to see the inequalities within countries and between countries. And without a holistic agenda, we can't actually make any progress to address those issues. So there were just a couple of things that I wanted to share from an event back in 2012. We said we must recognize that structural changes are needed, not just another set of goals that narrow the development agenda. And I mean, that's basically what we're still saying now. And we said we needed safeguards based on human rights to protect traditional users of land and natural resources, in particular women, from negative impact of investments. That's a small illustration of why we needed a holistic agenda. We talked about corporate accountability, redress for damage. We talked about equitable sharing of environmental space, looking at rural and urban areas, And I also wanted to highlight from 2014 what the Women's Major Group brought, and I think was really taken on by the lead negotiators in the post-2015 process. She brought up poetry. Emilia Reyes brought up poetry in one of the sessions, saying that really we need to bring poetry into this, and that post-2015 could be the poetic field where we agree new language that's in the vanguard even 15 years from now and sounds fresh to the ears of government, citizens, and stakeholders. And we're still trying to get there, but we did see the SDGs and the agenda as something that was really holistic and meant to have lines drawn through it, around it, in it, and not just picking out one particular cluster of goals to look at each year, because we know we don't lead single issue lives. Governments don't work on policies in vacuums. They are actually speaking to each other at national level. So it has to be done at a global level too. And I mean, there are so many quotes. I really had fun doing this, but I think what we see in terms of the silos and the clusters that aren't working now is that it's not only not recognizing full identities of people, it's resulting in half solutions. We're seeing unintended consequences where work on the environment is not thinking about LGBTQI people and the impacts on them, or working on social issues may be highly carbon intensive in some way that's not really brought to the fore. And so we have to think about those particular issues and really how, with the pandemics, with climate change, we are continually seeing disruptions. And if we're only picking piece by piece, we won't see those effective transformative solutions we're aiming for. Thank you.
Thanks, Eleanor. That was a really powerful way to wrap up, because really we are looking for transformative successes, really, not just peaking here and there. And thank you so much for that history lesson. It was really both great to hear those, but also so, you know, in a very small way, a little sad and frustrating that we still need that kind of language now to still be able to push the agenda and the connection of it, but really important to continue this work. And that's why this event was even needed, for us to be able to have this conversation. So really quite necessary. Thank you so much for that. And I'm seeing that people are putting questions and comments. So thank you so much for that. We're definitely going to get to it in a minute. So I'm just going to ask a second round of questions before we jump to the Q&A. So now I'm going to go back to Ambassador Schlyter, and I'm just going to ask her, you know, what would be Sweden's suggestions for making SDGs implementation, follow-up and review more effective? And, you know, when we're talking about effectiveness, we're in our view, yes, that also must be human rights centered, and it must make it possible for us to overcome structural barriers to sustainable development and gender equality. So we're just curious from Sweden's perspective, even looking at the examples that you gave, you know, what can you recommend in terms of making the SDGs more implementation? Is it the 4 areas that you mentioned, or you feel like there's some other things that Sweden has done to make it more effective? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that question. I mean, it really is about having an inclusive approach. There are many stakeholders in the implementation of the SDGs, and probably there's not a magic formula to achieve it, but really it is all about making sure that there is a joint ownership of the implementation. It can't belong to any specific ministry, authority, or industry, but to everyone, and of course also beyond the government. But at the same time, there needs to be a structure in place to avoid that everyone's responsibility doesn't become no one's responsibility. So in our whole of society approach, we've applied this to the government itself at every level. And I could take some examples again on how we work. There's a group of 16 state secretaries from different ministries that has been formed, and they have the responsibility to follow up on the commitments and the implementation of the agenda. And each ministry has a coordinator for the national implementation of the agenda. And these coordinators meet once a month to keep each other in the loop and make sure that Sweden acts consistently, no matter what subject matter or platform. Another crucial tool is, of course, the VNRs. And from our side, we've committed to do a VNR at least once during each mandate of the government. We're doing one this year. As you know, we're presenting our second VNR on Thursday next week. And the VNRs serve a number of purposes, of course, that they're platforms to engage and to listen to a plenitude of stakeholders. This year, we've included a specific focus on youth and conducted a specific consultation for this purpose. And what these consultations have shown, among other things, is that people between 15 and 24 have a particular interest in environment and climate-related questions. So that's an important observation. The second were issues related to gender equality. One thing to notice is that 75% of the respondents were young people identifying as women, and that highlights a challenge, how to engage young men in the work for sustainable development. I'd like to also measure the importance of tools to measure progress and challenges. There has to be consistency in indicators, because otherwise you can't compare as easily between reports. And this also makes it easier to hold decision makers and stakeholders accountable. I'd like to mention also localizing the SDGs. We believe that in using the VLRs as tools to engage cities and regions, and we would like to see these reports get a more official standing in the HLPF. And this year, 4 Swedish cities are presenting VLRs, Uppsala, Stockholm, Helsingborg, and Malmö. And their reports, of course, have been posted together with our national report on Sweden's HLPF page. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Really appreciate it. And it's really interesting to hear about the youth consultation. It would be great to, at some point, maybe somebody will ask a question on how it was done and how we were able to capture diversity. But the fact that it was 75% of women and girls really does go to show that there is some work that needs to be done and the issues. And I also really like the idea of cities reporting as well. That's great. That's something I think we as advocates can challenge our towns and cities to see how they can really take on that localization agenda in particular. So thank you so much for that. So I'm going to go to Ambassador Sandoval. My second question is, what will be Mexico's approach within the UN space into the future to ensure a human rights centered and genuine sustainable development? And of course, we can't ask this question without asking, how would we include the issues of gender equality in this work? So really curious about Mexico's approach within the UN space to ensure a human rights centered, a genuine sustainable development agenda, and how would we include gender equality within that?
Thank you very much for your questions. Well, as you all know, more than 45 years ago, Mexico hosted the first World Conference of Women. Last year, we formally adopted a feminist foreign policy. And this year, Mexico has actively advocated for gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls in the ministerial declaration of the HLPF. I will tell you that this feminist foreign policy really is a real commitment, and we are always fighting in every single resolution, in every single démarche, to have the gender element and the perspective. I think that somebody has his microphone open. Because, thank you.
Okay.
Our commitment to place the gender equality agenda at the heart of our foreign policy and as a public policy that is well known is clear and it's strong. It's a real commitment of the country. Gender inequality became exacerbated by the pandemic, like so many other inequalities. The dramatic increase of sexual and gender-based violence, including harmful practices, domestic and intimate partner violence, as a result of lockdowns and social distancing measures, are seen in every region of the world. We have talked many times about this. In addition, as the impacts of crisis are never gender neutral, and COVID-19 is no exception, the socioeconomic impact has disproportionately affected women, with more losing their jobs or unable to attain equal pay for equal work. In our perspective, the COVID-19 pandemic should be seen as a learning lesson to all parts of government and society, including the private sector. It is a lesson that foreshadows and forces us to look in the mirror and address the structural barriers to prevent us from fulfilling the 2030 agenda. Particularly, these are the same barriers behind why women tend to earn less in the labor market, to have fewer savings, to be disproportionately represented in the informal economy, to have less access to social protections, and to be burdened with unpaid care and domestic work with their households, forcing them to drop out the labor force, the former one, at the expense of sustainable economies. For this reason, it is quite remarkable that the HLPF Ministerial Declaration this year calls for the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women in the COVID-19 recovery process. Without their participation, we'll be leaving behind half of the humanity, or even more than half of the humanity, decreasing our possibilities to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. This is worth reflecting on. Women in all their diversity, who constitute more than half of humanity, still face structural barriers in the form of negative social and cultural norms, which perpetuate inequalities and male dominance, concentrating power and decision-making in patriarchal elites, preventing them from fully contributing as agents of change. For these very simple reasons, and listening to the streets of our countries, Mexico, jointly with France, along with UN Women and civil society organizations, we hosted the Generation Equality Forum this year, contributing to a constructive and inclusive dialogue between multiple actors. The forum made it possible to advance in defining the 6 action coalitions and the Women, Peace and Security and Humanitarian Action Compact, putting the rights of women and girls at the heart of actions towards the fulfillment of the 2030 agenda and the SDGs, especially in the next 5 years. Above all, the Generation Equality Forum marked a historic shift in power and perspective, which has made gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls a long-term issues for international community. We want to thank all our allies in this initiative, which had the feminist movement, women's organizations, youth, and youth activists as protagonists. Their meaningful participation will be essential to guarantee a gender-responsive COVID-19 recovery and a better future for women and girls in the years to come. In my perspective, if you are not part of the solution, you are part of the problem. In this context, we must ask ourselves, are we fully seizing the opportunity to build back better, fairer, and more equal? Mexico's feminist foreign policy compels us to make the system barriers faced by women and girls around the world visible in UN negotiations, as we attempt to build bridges to address these challenges. While it has been disappointing to see such a dramatic pushback on mainstreaming and gender's perspective into the recovery efforts during the negotiations, we are very thankful to our civil society colleagues and to like-minded delegations for helping us to come to an outcome that allow for more ambitious commitments going forward. A gender-responsive recovery is the only way forward if we really want to walk the talk and achieve the Agenda 2030 and the SDGs. And I will share with you that yesterday, during the presentation that setting the scenario for this HLPF, I had the opportunity as chair of the integration segment of ECOSOC to present 10 points and 10 points setting the scenario for HLPF. And at that moment, there was one of the main points of the very first one. We were talking about the new social contract that we really need to have between peoples and governments to rebuild trust with governments and the people who are governed. And in this rebuilding of trust, there was an essential element that should be addressed, that is to have the gender's perspective on everything, absolutely everything we have. There, as part of the new social trust, women's equality must be at the center, because we are, as just mentioned, talking about more than a half of humanity, and it's something that must be not only underscored, but this new social trust, new social contract after the pandemic is our big opportunity for making this a reality and for having women's equality everywhere. And this must be a part of it. We cannot avoid that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing and for saying that we cannot avoid it. Really important points. We hope we can get more countries who feel that strongly about it and who are willing, especially even the countries who made the commitments at the forum as well, to see them actually put them into place. COVID is really the test for that. And until countries are able to actually deliver on that, we will continue to push them. So thank you so much for that intervention. Now, my next question is going to go to Eleanor. Eleanor, you were among the women major groups members that prepared our current position paper for this HLPF review. Would you mind highlighting some of the main proposal in that position paper? And could you also share with us from what frameworks these key proposals were developed?
Sure, and thank you for that question. I also want to thank the ambassador for strongly pointing out intersectionality and systemic barriers and really drawing on and highlighting many of the issues that the Women's Major Group also highlights. So I would say that first, the framework that the Women's Major Group paper is based around is first and foremost a human rights framework. We know that human rights are universal, inalienable, indivisible, interdependent, and interrelated. And so as a framing, that is the best way to look at a holistic 2030 agenda. But I think the paper also comes from a justice, anti-racist, and anti-colonialist framework that fully recognizes achieving gender equality is absolutely linked to the 2030 agenda, to the promotion and protection of human rights, and to the environment and international peace and security. And as I said before, new challenges are regularly emerging, like climate-induced disasters, global pandemics, such as COVID-19, which unmask how interrelated the issues are, and to highlight the root causes that we tend to, we sort of the global we, decision makers in all cases, the root causes and persistent structural barriers, which are most difficult to address. And many decision makers prefer to push this to the side a bit. But these new challenges coming also spotlight how vital it is to take this holistic approach. So in the paper, the Women's Major Group laid out 6 key recommendations about improving the HLPF follow-up and review, and then also a specific proposal for HLPF review that has a non-siloed review cycle. And I'll go briefly through the recommendations, touch a bit on what it might look like to have a non-siloed HLPF review, and then we'll leave it for questions. So the 6 recommendations include more of a focus on systemic barriers. So really creating that space to analyze the root causes and systemic issues that are slowing progress, particularly on gender inequality, social protection, the global division of labor, and think that the things that are hindering the transformation to environmental justice and social and economic justice. So in this case, the Women's Major Group calls for attention to the economic, trade, tax, monetary, and financial frameworks, and then ending militarism and changing social and cultural norms such as patriarchy, fundamentalism, casteism, racism, and many of the other isms that are a scourge for the world. There's also, the second recommendation is a more systemic annual comprehensive review of the SDGs. And so this is really the basis of looking at the, moving from the clustered silo approach that we've heard is blocking advancement to something that is more holistic and would allow more integration of civil society inputs from affected communities and also from independent experts and UN special rapporteurs. There are a lot of opportunities in that. The third is that the HLPF should be truly an open policy space for meaningful participation of civil society. And we've seen in the context of shrinking civic space worldwide that also the HLPF is faltering on its promise of being the most open space for civil society. So that needs to continued vigilance, and we really appreciate the support of governments who make sure that other member states are thinking about that each time. One of the really key recommendations from my perspective is how the HLPF should really emphasize a policy coherence with human rights mechanisms and sustainable development imperatives. And so this means linking to the treaty bodies, to the UN specialized agencies, and very clearly building this in to the annual work of the HLPF. Then the fifth is that the HLPF must change from being a space to passively report to actively review and act. And this means that there should be active country engagement and change the way the VNRs are done so that it's not a presentation and Q&A that is glossy and beautiful, but not very substantive and really doesn't recognize the hard work of the government to produce the report or any of the inputs, and certainly doesn't bring in, as the ambassador from Sweden was talking about, the city reports and all the other work that is going on at sub-levels. Then there's another issue that is absolutely crucial to understanding what's happening on the ground, which is increasing the role of the regional forums and building this fully annualized cycle so that we're not only looking at June in New York, but really seeing what's happening in the region. So there's space there to have something more sustained and more iterative and that draws on the experts who may not be in New York or be able to access the space. It should also build on the ECOSOC commissions like the CSW, Generation Equality Forum even, and GA committees. And Buky, let me know if I'm running out of time. I can always raise.
You are, because I want to get, one more intervention from Sai and then give people a chance to ask questions as well. So
yep, I can answer the rest in that time. Thanks.
That would be so great. Thank you so much, Eleanor. I appreciate that. Okay, so I'm quickly going to go to Sai so we can ask you your question and then we can give people a chance because there's been some really great questions in the chat. So if you all can take a look at it as well, I'm going to be asking it anyway, but if there are ones you really would love to answer, please take a look so that I can make sure that I highlight that as well. So Sai, there's something that Eleanor said, which I want to build on, which is the role of the regional mechanisms. And since, one of ARU's really big work is around supporting youth advocates to the Youth Forum to ensure that their voices are heard and the perspectives are included, my question to you is how do you see that role of the regional mechanisms, especially the Youth Forum, in doing that?
Yeah. So totally building on what Eleanor has also said around the regional mechanisms, I think there is something that we can actually share from the Asia and the Pacific region. So we all know that the regional follow-up and review mechanisms are existing annually in the Asia region. We have the Asia Pacific Forum on Sustainable Development, which is an intergovernmental fora. But in addition to that, civil society has organized ourselves. There is this APRSEM civil society platform, which is the Asia Pacific Regional CSO Engagement Mechanism. This is a regional mechanism. This has been in place for many years now, and this is a civil society platform, and it is aimed to strengthen cross-constituency coordination and ensure that the voice of sub-regions across the Asia and the Pacific are heard in the intergovernmental spaces. So this platform, this APRSM platform, this has been initiated, this has been owned, this has been driven by CSOs, and it seeks to engage CSOs, UN agencies, and member states in the regional follow-up and review of the SDG agenda. So this is quite an effective regional mechanism, and it is, it is contributing very effectively towards the APFSD outcomes, or the regional outcomes, which basically build into the HLPF. Apart from that, we also want to highlight, and can I go to the next slide, the other regional mechanism, which is the APFSD Youth Forum. So this is another mechanism that has been institutionalized in the region, and this is co-convened by the youth constituency, and Arrow has played a significant role in bringing this together. And this is a dedicated space for young people in order to discuss along the theme of the APFSD every year, to discuss what is it from young people's perspective that needs to be integrated into the intergovernmental fora. Since 2017, different regional call to actions, which are like, from a youth lens, have been brought forward. And we are very happy to share also, because in 2021, as a result of COVID, and also in 2020, we were thinking, how do we, implement this regional mechanism? And we actually had a virtual coming together of young people in the region. And this time we had 500 young people, young feminists, young people in all their diversity from across 34 countries coming and discussing the theme of the HLPF 2021 and the APFSD Forum 2021. And they came up with huge recommendations, different recommendations. And if we go to the next slide, as a result of this concerted work, not only did we come with a regional call to action, which was taken into the intergovernmental processes, but also we had sub-regional call to actions. We had national level call to actions, which are now a body of recommendations which are by young people, which will be taken up at the national level follow-up as well throughout this year. So these are the, this is how the regional mechanisms are thriving in the Asia and the Pacific region, and we thought we could share this with you.
Thank you so much for sharing with us. So we're hoping that those from other regions will see it. So I'm going to jump to questions because we don't have too much time, and I want to give people enough time to ask questions. So I'm going to go to Ambassador Sandoval first of all, because he got the first question. So I'm going to give him the honor of answering the first question, and I'm going to combine two questions in one. So Pam had put in there that, Mexico has been pushing for the for SDG 5 to be a cross-cutting issue. So her question is, what has been the problem? What are the bottlenecks for it to be something that can be reported every year? So she was curious about that. And then there was a follow-up question that was just even asking then, and I don't know, maybe you can also include this in your answer about then, how to mainstream SDG 5 and 10 into the so that gender equality can be mainstreamed. That was really that. What should we be doing to ensure that Goal 5 and Goal 10 can be mainstreamed? But first, what are the problems in ensuring that SDG 5 could be reported every year?
Thank you for the questions. In fact, I will tell you. The problem it comes from the origin. From 2015, the resolution that give the mandate to the HLPF to make the assessment of the SDGs created some clusters. So artificial groupings of SDGs to be seen in depth every single year. In depth, and I will tell you what the ones who defend this system said, it doesn't mean that you cannot see the other SDGs. But for the thematic assessments of the HLPF, it was not possible of having the 17 SDGs every single year. That's the main reason of why we have these groupings that we don't like and that we feel that goes against the spirit of the interlinkages or having the whole approach or the whole vision of development. We shouldn't create these divisions. So since we cannot see, if we cannot see all SDGs every single year, which is the case, and maybe it's true, what Mexico proposed following the GSDR proposal was to find some other concepts to make the assessment of all the SDGs related in those concepts, not necessarily the SDG itself, but another concept like an umbrella concept that could allow us to assess maybe 10, maybe 12 SDGs at the same time. And each year having, we call it the entry points and these umbrellas or concepts that could help us for doing this assessment every year. But it has been a long discussion. You know, there is always at the UN a lot of resistance to change. Why you want to change if we are at the beginning of the SDGs? Why you are coming with these ideas now? Well, we just request the experts, the real experts, the statisticians, the ones that can really have the assessments in depth of the SDGs, what could be the perfect system of doing so if we got the GSDR report. And we try to invite and to motivate all the countries to change for that, but we didn't have much success. Unfortunately, it's the way that we are working, that we will be working the following years. This year, there are some changes in the way we will be working for the next, what do we have, 9 years until 2030. We are improving the system. And what we have to do is not use SDG 5 like the concept of SDG 5, but what maybe we can use the gender perspective or women's and girls perspective in every single SDGs. That's what we have to do. If we are doing an assessment of each one of the SDGs in depth every year, the component gender must always be considered. And let's not talk about the SDG 5 or SDG 10, because we're going to enter in conflict, saying that it's not their year to be assessed, but it's absolutely not logical of having a gender assessment only each 4 years. And I know that you will share my opinion on that totally. But what we have to keep in mind is that it's very easy. Don't worry. It was maybe at the beginning, it was not a good beginning. But what we can do is every time we are assessing an SDG, always recall the gender perspective of all of them. And that's a good way of solving the issue. And we can have it. It's not formal in the resolution, but let's do it in the practice. That's a solution, basically.
Thank you so much for that. Okay, so I'm going to jump to Eleanor and Sai. I'll ask you questions and then I'll come back to the ambassadors, because of course the ambassadors, there seems to be more questions here. So I'll come back to you in the wrap-up sessions, but thank you so much for answering that. And hopefully we're able to pick up some of the responses from there, Pam and Shanta. Okay, so Eleanor, the question to you was, you know, since the major group system was agreed in 1992 at the Earth Summit, but it seems like none of the countries, you know, none of the countries has adopted the major group system. What are the, actual achievements, and what is the role of Women's Major Group Global? That's a lot in there, but maybe you can just, quickly, answer a little bit of that, because we could be here all day if you answer that properly.
Yes, and I'm probably not the right person to answer every aspect of that, since I don't necessarily know the national context in many cases. I think one of the major challenges of having a major group and other stakeholder system at national level is that not every country has a sustainable development mechanism that it could be applied to. I think it'd be really interesting to understand how that's working in any countries or in terms of approaching a specific ministry. I know in the US, things were cobbled together, and the US at a national level, most people don't actually know what the SDGs are. So there's definitely a lot of work, and I can see how valuable major groups and other stakeholders system would be to support that, the interaction across sectors and also across generations, as I saw people speaking about in the chat. And then the second part was, what was the success of the women's major group then, if it hasn't been nationalized in that way? Well, I think it's exactly related to what I just said, that it doesn't exist at the national level. So having a women's major group where women and allies and non-binary folks can come together and discuss the issues with others who might be from their country or their region, that's really one of the major successes, is to bring in the voices from the ground, from the different sectors and different countries. So it's absolutely crucial to have the women's major group and the major group and other stakeholder system to interact and make those voices visible in a way that's not possible to a national level, especially on the cross-border and cross-country issues like climate change that can't be solved by one nation alone. So there's way more on that, like you said, Buky, but I will leave it there and try to think of more.
Yeah, thank you so much, Eleanor. And I'll just add to that to just help you out, especially as the Anglophone Women Major Group organizing partner at the regional level, and how that connects to the national as well. And I think it's quite important to say that, you know, one thing we've seen in terms of like coordinating at the regional and the global level is that we're bringing a national perspective. So it's important to remember that women's major groups members also work very strongly at the national level. We're seeing them developing shadow reports. We're seeing them, you know, ensuring that the work that they're doing is being included in the national SDG report. So it's from that we take to the regional level, right, to coordinate with each other and support and try to hold our countries accountable before we then bring that also to the global level. So all of these are functioning together. They're not completely cohesive sometimes, and we are seeing that some regions are more coordinated than others. So for example, at the Africa level, we're adopting a regional mechanism that's very similar to what we've seen from Asia, because we saw how effective it was. And that has led to also some national chapters as well. So it's not completely, you know, seamless yet. There's still ways we're looking to make it more effective and to be stronger as civil society, but I would say that it's happening. So you know, everyone has a different definition of success, but I think it's quite important to just highlight that as well, that really what's happening in the global also influences the regional and also influences the national and vice versa as well. So I would just add that to that. So thank you, Eleanor. I'm going to quickly jump to Sai, and I'm going to combine two questions for you. I think you already answered one in the chat, but I'll give you a chance to speak to it as well. But somebody had asked, you know, in terms of like, what are your recommendations for meaningful and inclusive youth participation in regional processes? I remember talking to someone and they were telling me that meaningful youth participation is not SMART in terms of like, you know, the SMART objectives and SMART goals. So I'd be interested in your answer, because I think it's important for people to see it as SMART. So, you know, what are the recommendations for that in regional processes? And then the issue of including older women, the things that they get lost. So how do we ensure the partnerships? So after you, then I'll go back to the two ambassadors to ask them the last questions. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Buky. Meaningful and inclusive youth participation, I think that in the regional mechanisms is, and through practical experience, what we have seen is young people come together, they have their own specific space where they discuss, they deliberate from a young person's lens. But at the same time, then take these recommendations into a larger constituency of people's forum, which is the APRSM mechanism, and then, you know, share it with everyone and come together in order to present that in the intergovernmental processes. So we cannot be in silos, but there is always, I mean, there is effectiveness for having that specific space for oneself in order to do the initial work, but then take it forward into the mainstream and work together in coordination. So, and this has been the practice that has been happening in the region. In addition, it's also about meaningful and inclusive youth-adult partnerships that we need to forge. We don't have to work from the scratch. Young feminists don't have to work from the scratch because there's so much of this abundance of work that has been put forward by feminists. From the questions we see, the older persons, I mean, the work, the experience of the older generation or of feminists can also be brought up, and then young feminists can take from there, and we can all work cohesively in order to make that sustainable development and sustainable change that we wish to see. So yeah, that's one input I can see from here.
Thank you so much for that, and thank you for responding to that. Really appreciate it. And if other people have comments and suggestions, you know, this is a safe space, so let's share. All right, so I'm going to go to Ambassador Schlyter. There were a couple of questions as well that I wanted to ask you, so I'm going to combine two of them for you. Actually, I'm going to do three. Sorry, Ambassador. For you, since we have you, just to get your final perspectives. There was, you know, a question thanking you for your commitments. But Ambassador Schlyter, they wanted to know your view on linking the binding processes under the Human Rights Council to the non-binding SDGs. So they wanted to know your view on that. There was also a question around how do we make the high-level political forum a space for accountability? Is another question. So if you could speak to that for a little bit as well, we would appreciate it. And then there was a question that was targeted at Ambassador Sandoval, but I think this is actually an important question for all of us across the world. And I wanted you to speak to that as well, is that, you know, we're seeing femicides continue to increase. We're seeing domestic violence, political violence, all forms of violence, and the lack of justice. So she was just curious about, you know, how do we really ensure that a gender perspective is applied? So quick question on linking the binding processes under the Human Rights Council to non-binding SDGs. How do we make the HLPF an accountable space? And then how do we ensure that gender perspective is generally applied? So it's not just lip service, it's not just all saying that we want, but how do we actually do it? So if there's any ways you could just speak to those. I know they're difficult questions, but hey, we have you here, so we're going to ask. So Ambassador Schlyter.
Thank you. Happy to take the challenge and do my best. I mean, the question on linking what we have on the human rights side with what we have in the HLPF, I guess, then refers to the treaty bodies, of course, and the dialogue there. Which is I mean, that process is not as binding as we sometimes would wish, but it is a system for dialogue about the implementation of the treaties that states have ratified. I mean, that process was strengthened, of course, in 2006 with the creation of the UPR, the Universal Periodic Review, which then pulls up the dialogue with the treaty bodies, which gives then an overview of each country's progress ahead of the reviews. And that's absolutely right. I often think that, I mean, we have these two reviews. One is a little newer than the other, but we do have to try and understand them together. And there, I think we have some work to do ourselves as member states, looking and trying to feed into others, but also in our own national systems to actually see them as a whole. So you're getting my unvarnished personal perception on that question. Space for accountability. I mean, I really have to come back to the VNR. I think that's where we have that that opportunity. And I already mentioned consistency in indicators, really to be able to make comparisons from occasion to occasion between reports. Also inclusion, broad participation, and here, of course, each government has a responsibility to make their delegations broad, and not only the delegations, of course, but the entire process. And I'm happy to say that our delegation, we have 80 people participating this year, NGOs, parliamentarians, business, government authorities. So, and of course that makes it better because we understand things in a different context. So that also is something I wanted to mention. Violence issues, I think all countries struggle with violence, gender-based violence, other types of violence, but in the context of generally gender equality, where we all have still much to do, I really have to come back to the feminist foreign policy and as a recommendation for countries to consider, and I know some other countries have also taken this on board. Seeing this from the inside of where I've worked myself for years, I think it's been a game changer. It's strengthened accountability within the system for driving these issues forward, but also for ensuring that we all have the knowledge we need to represent these issues. It's not about somebody who's a specialist in your ministry, but at every high level, you do represent gender equality, and that's been tremendously important. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, and thank you for taking a stab at answering that. I'm just going to jump to Ambassador Sandoval to wrap up this Q&A because we also need to launch some infographics before we go. So I can only give you about a minute. And I actually do want to ask the question that had been asked in Spanish that I'd also posed to Ambassador Schlyter, which is, we know that women are suffering and are not getting justice. We know the issue of violence has increased during COVID and prior to that as well. How can the gender perspective be applied genuinely? How can it really make a difference in the lives of women and girls?
Thank you very much for very good questions. I will respond. I would also like to add on to the previous one. That was a good one about the binding nature of the UPR and the non-binding nature of the VNRs that are voluntary national reviews. Well, I think that the ambassador of Sweden had a very good response. The binding character is basically that you are forced to make the presentation. That's basically that, and to report on the implementation of legal instruments. And on the VNR, you are not forced to make the presentation. They don't give you a year and a precise date to make your presentation. Is something that each government chooses to report on development results on how they are implementing the SDGs. So really the nature is different. So, and it's important that we keep that in mind. But at the end, does it make weaker the VNRs? I don't think so. I don't think so precisely because all society, we are doing a close monitoring on the countries and the government's behavior through social media. And it's something that we shouldn't lose in our current times, because we are as citizens more empowered than ever in history because of social media. Because if something is wrong, you don't have to wait for a press article. You can come immediately through social media for making a denunciation or to make comments or to have a real dialogue and a constructive dialogue with the authorities of every government. So we are living, and we have to realize that. Sometimes we don't realize that our predecessors never had the chance and never has had the power of the voice of social media. And that has changed totally the world and in the way that we approach things. Just imagine on how different times we are. Well, to the point that I'm seeing everything that I've been said this morning is already in social media. You are very fast in typing, and it's fantastic. And I thank you for that. And of course, that's part of the beauty of the new times. And also about the violence and to make women's rights a reality, it's also related to that. Through social media and through always present the denunciation of everything that is wrong, we really need a cultural change. We will never have the real equality we need between men and women if we don't have a deep cultural change in all our countries, in all our societies. We must educate children, boys, girls, to live in an equal space and to have the same rights, and not only to say it, but to do it in practice. That the cultural change begins by every house, by every family. We have to educate boys with a gender perspective. Otherwise, we will never have a real change and the real realization of the parity rights. We really need to work on that, and it's going to take maybe a generation. But I think that the way we are doing and the way that we are monitoring every single situation on the violation of women's rights in every country, at least in my country, is extraordinarily live, extraordinarily active, and we are doing this together. Government, authorities, diplomats, society. We are on this together, and we will need to really anchor the changes and have the cultural change we all need. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I want to thank all of the panelists. Thank you so much for answering our questions. Thank you for being here. Thank you for engaging with these really important issues. I hope we all have learned a lot. I hope we've all been able to learn from each other, and I hope we've taken some really critical things. So really thank you so much for saying yes and for being here. And before we let everyone go, I still have you for 2 minutes. We do want to share that we have been having a series on the SDGs and human rights frameworks. So trying to connect the work on gender equality, not just to the SDGs, but to various human rights frameworks, like the Universal Periodic Review is mentioned, the work being done by the Human Rights Council, looking at the Convention on Torture, looking at all of the human rights mechanism. So today we're launching our infographic series on the SDGs and UN human rights mechanisms from a feminist perspective. It's a compilation of work, like I mentioned, from the beginning of the year. It has the expertise and knowledge of many of our members and also many of our guests as well on these issues. And we had a lot of amazing guests. So trust me, I moderated a couple of them and they were pretty amazing. We, as the Women's Major Group, believe and advocate for human rights-centered SDGs implementation and review. And we know that to achieve this, we need a stronger connection between the human rights mechanisms and the sustainable development processes, as has been mentioned in this conversation. And the webinars and the infographic series has been our contributions to those efforts. So I know Andrea is sharing them right now. We hope that you would access the series, it's in the chat. So click on it, share it. As Ambassador Sandoval said, social media is really powerful, even when it's banned in countries like Nigeria and we have to use VPN. But hey, we still make it work because they try to bury us, but we are seeds. So we will continue to speak out and speak up, especially as feminists. So here are the series. So please click on it. Please share it widely, disseminate widely. There's so much concrete and important information in here. Yes, so please, yes, it is an amazing series. I can vouch for it. So, but again, let me just really say thank you to our panelists. You can use your reactions to clap, to throw celebrations, and to really thank all of our panelists. So Ambassador Sandoval, Ambassador Schlyter, Eleanor, and Sai, thank you so much. I also want to say thank you to our Women's Major Group partners who worked really hard on the side events and proposed it. I really want to say thank you to Shanaz and Andrea for their really great work in coordinating and making all of this possible. I know our panelists got a lot of emails from them. So just want to say thank you to you all, and hopefully we can have a very feminist HLPF. So thank you so much, everyone.